los pronombres de objeto indirecto. ¿Cómo identificamos los objetos indirectos? An indirect object is the person who receives the indirect action of the verb. To find this person, identify the verb in your sentence and ask yourself, ¿a quién, to whom, or para quién, for whom? Por ejemplo, le doy la diagnosis al paciente. I'm going to identify my verb, which is doy. I'm going to ask myself, ¿a quién le doy la diagnosis? And the answer is al paciente. Therefore, I know that my indirect object is al paciente. Next, I have el médico me escribe un informe a mí. So I find my verb, escribe. I ask myself, ¿para quién escribe un informe? And the answer is para mí. So now I know my indirect object. ¿Cuáles son los pronombres de objeto indirecto? An indirect object pronoun is required when an indirect object is present. It does not replace the indirect object, but it tells us where the direct object is going. You'll see more of that in our examples coming up, but here are the indirect object pronouns for you to choose from. And again, to test your knowledge, we'll bring in the indirect objects from our previous examples. So we have al paciente y a mí. The indirect object pronoun for al paciente is le, and the indirect object pronoun for a mí is me. ¿Cómo formamos una frase con pronombre de objeto indirecto? In the following sentences, notice how the indirect object pronoun and indirect object can both be present or not. Both sentences are correct and acceptable. Additionally, always remember to place the pronoun before the conjugated verb, like we talked about with direct object pronouns. So our ejemplo es, le doy la diagnosis al paciente. Here you can see what we mean about how both the indirect object pronoun and the indirect object can be present. We could also have le doy la diagnosis. Here we do not need to have the indirect object present. So you'll notice that's a big difference between the direct object and the direct object pronoun. Those two cannot coexist, but with our indirect they can. And what we're saying here is, I give the diagnosis to him. Otra vez tenemos una regla especial. The placement of the indirect object pronoun is in front of the verb unless you are using an infinitive or a gerund. In this case, you would have the option to place the indirect object pronoun in front of the verb sequence or attach it to the end, just like we see with direct object pronouns. So for an example of infinitive verbs, we have el médico me va a explicar los resultados. Remember, we could have the indirect object if we want, but it's not required, which is why it's in parentheses. So a mí. If we don't have it in front, then it goes at the end. So we have el médico va a explicarme los resultados. Now we have gerunds. Remember that a gerund has estar plus ando or yendo. In English, it's the same as saying ing at the end of your verb. So, el médico me está explicando los resultados a mí. So the doctor is explaining the results to me. Or we have el médico está explicándome los resultados a mí. Once again, that gerund, putting the indirect or direct object pronoun at the end of the gerund causes some trickiness in that you have to decide where to place an accent mark. So if you place an indirect object pronoun at the end of the gerund, you must add an accent 3 vowels from the end, just like we saw with the direct object pronouns. So if you can see my cursor, I have explicándome. I'm going to go from the end. 1, 2, 3 vowels. So I have it on the A. Explicándome. Vamos a practicar. Go ahead and read through this slide. Pause so that you have plenty of time to do so. And then when you're ready, continue for the answers. Entonces, la frase es, necesito entregar el libro al profesor. There are 2 ways to rewrite this sentence using an indirect object pronoun. Remember that if we have a conjugated verb, the verb that comes after is infinitive, necesito entregar. So now we have an infinitive, that's why we have 2 options. We can either put our indirect object pronoun at the beginning or the end. So if we were to put it at the beginning, our sentence would be, le necesito entregar el libro al profesor. Remember that indirect object can repeat, but not necessary, which is why it's in parentheses. And if we were to put it at the end, we would say, necesito entregarle el libro al profesor.